Good afternoon and welcome to the Park Forum. I'm Peggy Szymanski from the Computing Science Laboratory, and today's forum is part of a series of talks hosted by the Workscapes and Organization area around the theme Quality of Life. Our speaker today is Bill Shillett from Google. Before joining Google, Bill was principal scientist with Intel's Digital Home Product Group and co-director of Intel Research Seattle. He was also part of the team that invented ubiquitous computing here at Park from 1992 to 1995. He received his PhD in computer science from Columbia University, and his research interest is ubiquitous information with a focus on the development of personal and mobile technologies supporting knowledge work. Today, Bill will be talking about mining quotations from very large-scale digital libraries. Please join me in welcoming Bill Shillett.
Thank you. So this talk will be more about the knowledge work side of my research interests. And it's in collaboration with Okan Kolak, who's a researcher in Google Book Search. It's a product group. I'm in Google Research. So let me situate a little bit this research. We have a site called books.google.com, and you can go to this site and search scanned books. There's over 1 million scanned and OCR'd books. The full text is available for search. These come from 28 partner libraries in the US, Europe, and Asia, and also thousands of publisher partners deposit their books here. The books are in dozens of languages, and that's an issue in what we're trying to attempt here. So I just want to remind people that before the web, there was this other source of information called books, and there's a lot of them out there. And actually, it's not quite clear how many of them are out there, but unique volumes, about 30 to 150 million, depending on how you count and what you count. And many organizations, including Google, decided that in these books, there's information that isn't available anywhere else, and we should make it available. So we started these projects of scanning and OCRing, and these scanned and OCR'd volumes are really different than the rest of the web. So what's different here is that books are text and not hypertext. So the authors, when they wrote books, they didn't necessarily put links into them to other books, although there are some things like citations. And the documents are much, much bigger in books than on the web. So it's not necessarily good enough to sort of land somebody on a book and say, figure it out from here. The information is in this book. You know, I have 400 pages that a person would have to read through. So our approach to dealing with taking this massive text corpus and sort of bringing it online was to ask the question, can we make it more accessible by adding links? So what we did is we mined and then linked quotations that we found in books. I should mention that we already are generating links for citations, table of contents, related books, sort of a computed value, and also back of the book index. So there's all sorts of links that are already there, but we thought that there weren't enough links and they didn't really point to the information that was interesting. So the reason we picked quotation was we have an ocean of text, and there's only some small pieces in that ocean that are really interesting. Many books have lots of words, but some nuggets in them. And what we wanted to do was really expose those nuggets. And pretty much, you know, we thought of this as creating a hypertext of thoughts. You know, there's thoughts in books. Authors copy from one book to another, and they make quotations because those pieces that they copy have some extra meaning. So we wanted to sort of expose those bits of meaning and link them together. So also we wanted to give users the ability, or readers the ability, while they're reading a book and they see a quotation, to jump to the primary source of that quotation. It's often useful if the quote might seem not quite right or out of context. Or if you're reading the primary source, you might want to jump to some analysis of that quotation and see what are people saying about this. So the third reason why we're looking at quotations was we sort of had this wacky idea that if you took a big book, you know, like Nietzsche's Man and Superman, and you only looked at the pieces that were highly quoted, you could create a summary of the book. So if you have a book report, you know, it's midnight, you're a student, late at night, you know, you got to read the book. Well, why don't you just read sort of the important nuggets, the ones that make sense. Now, what kind of quotations are we talking about here? There's lots of quotations. It's a very broad term to say the word quotation. On the one hand, there are things that a lot of people are familiar with, these cliches, bon mots, or Bartlett's kinds of phrases that you see a lot. Like, I have never let my schooling interfere with my education, famous Mark Twain quote. But what we're really looking for are a different style of quotation, something that's more historical, definitional, conceptual. A good example is, I shall not today attempt further to define it, but I know it when I see it. This is from a Supreme Court issue around, what was it around? Pornography, thank you. There was Justice Potter Stewart said this, and it really defined an issue, and it's used a lot when people are talking about that issue. So what we're really looking at are these kinds of quotes that are really pervasive through books, that aren't things that you might necessarily say at a cocktail party. And you know, one thing that's really surprising is how many of these there are and the coverage of these across books. So let me give you some examples. Vannevar Bush defined trailblazers as finding delight in the task of establishing useful trails through the enormous mass of the common record. Last time we took a look, this was in 33 of the books that we have. Leo Szilard, you know, the fellow who discovered chain reaction, has this kind of anecdote about how he did it while he was crossing the street, which is highly quoted in 43 books. Thomas Jefferson on government in 557 books. Spinoza, proposition, highly quoted. Jackson Pollock, how he does art. You know, for some reason, he needs to put it on the floor and get resistance. It's not enough to have the paint drip. And this one, which, you know, you don't normally think of as a famous person, there's this thing called the Brundtland Report, which actually is a pretty good description, definition of ecopolitics. And the concept of sustainable development is an issue in ecology and politics, and this quote is used broadly when those topics are being discussed. So these are the kinds of quotes we wanted to get, because if you look at these quotes across these books, they're talking about the same issue, they define something, there's some kind of interesting connection to them. So I want to spend a few minutes on how not to mine quotations. These are all the ways that we tried and failed first. When you ask people, they say, well, why don't you just take Bartlett's? You know, you probably already have that in your collection, and then just do a string search on Bartlett's. And the problem with Bartlett's is that it's a static data set. It doesn't really change. Where in our case, we have books that are being added all the time. And we also weren't so interested in a data set that's biased by editors who have defined what's important. You know, we were interested in this wisdom of the crowds effect that let the authors who are writing the books define the important pieces in those books. So also, technically, if you were to take a list of quotations like Bartlett's and try and do search through them, you still have this problem that quotations don't exactly match. Language changes over time. People interject speech acts. Sometimes there's misquotation. So we also have OCR errors in our corpus. So this isn't so much a good solution, a good general solution. And then, you know, the next thing that people ask is, well, why don't you just use quote marks? You know, just go look for some quote marks. All those things are quotes. So it turns out that a lot of this stuff with quote marks isn't quotes. It's dialogue. So you get a whole bunch of other stuff, and you miss a whole bunch of stuff that is quotes. So here it is maybe in the primary source, and here's a style of indentation. You also see styles of italics, boldface, and across languages, you see all sorts of styles of quotation. So if we were just to look for quote marks or try and pick up stylistic clues from the surface punctuation, would that work in Manchu or some other language? So it turns out it doesn't really work, and what does work is just this principle that a quote is a quote because it's been repeated. So that's the theory. Given a large enough corpus, you can find things that repeat, and those things are quotes. And we do have a large enough corpus. We have over 1 million books, and so we do see a lot of repeats. Now, this actually gets quotes, but it brings in a lot of other stuff that repeats. So it seemed like a good idea, and then you try it, and you find boilerplates. Penguin Books published. This is a copyright page. Citations actually are an interesting kind of repeat because this book reference repeats. And here's this woman who would always thank her editor at the beginning of all her books, and she wrote 20-odd books, and it was always thanking my agent, Marie Brown, for all their support. And of course, these things like tables of prime numbers repeat, tables of logarithms. We have all sorts of strange books in the collection that have texts that repeat. And one of the favorite things that we found, one of my interns dug this up. We found, right. So in the back of the books that we scanned from a library of a nearby university, they all had this little sticker that basically said, if your book is overdue, you're going to be fined for it. And this was in 500 or 1,000 books. So we have a technique of finding quotes, but we also have this problem that there's a lot of other junk. So basically what we do is we mine these repeated texts. We call them sequences, repeated pieces of text. And then we filter out the really bad stuff, and then we rank everything else by its quotationness or its quotedness. And then we generate this link structure that lets users navigate within and across books. So the end result of this process is what we believe to be the world's largest known quotation collection. It's many orders of magnitude larger than the other online collections, the Columbia Book of Quotations, Bartlett's Quotations, et cetera. So I have 2 technical slides because this is a Google talk. I think I should mention, all the machine hours that we put into this. and just forgive me, bear with me, I'll explain at a high level what's going on. So what we do here is a technique called shingling, which is a popular technique in information retrieval nowadays. And basically what you see here is the concept of shingling, which is a sliding window of a fixed size across a text that produces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Here it's a 8 shingling. It produces a string of 8 words that sort of moves. And it's like a shingle on a house, they overlap. And the reason we use shingling is because what we can do with a shingle is we can use this instead of sentences which aren't well defined, especially across languages. And it provides us a way of concisely representing text. We actually take a shingle and we compute a hash value for that. We throw away the text for all the further processing stages. So the first step in our process is what we call the shingle table generation, where you take all the books, millions of books, and you shingle them, and you build a table that tells you that for each shingle, which books does it exist in and in which positions. So here we know, this is the end result, here we know that a shingle with a hash value of 10 exists in book A at position 3 and book B at position 22. So you already have sort of a hint that those two books have something in common. It might not be a quotation, but at least it's a run of text of the shingle size. So this ends up with a huge file or set of files of many terabytes. We then take that shingle table, and essentially what we want to do is say, well, we know all of the fixed size pieces. Can we expand those to the longest run of common pieces across books? We call those sequences. So we do that by basically distributing this shingle bucket to each book. And at this point, book A will see that it has something in common with book C and book D in position 1. Position 2, it has something in common with book C in position 29, book D in 20. So now book A can sort of linearly go through this table and find all the runs in all the other books that have in common. And what we end up with here is 20 billion sequences, a lot of sequences, that are the longest pieces of text that are in common between two books. So one problem, of course, is that sequences aren't precise. When people quote, they change text. We also have other issues. So what we do is, let me give you an example. When we have a sequence for a quote, here's a famous quote by Prime Minister Nehru about the Indian independence. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. And you see that somebody quotes just the first sentence. Somebody sort of quotes the first few words with an interjection, and then the rest, a couple of sentences. Here we have a situation where the E's on this scanned book are all mistaken for some other letter. And so actually our processing doesn't quite notice that long years ago we made as part of a quote because the OCR is in error. You get a similar effect if people sort of change the words, and you see that a lot. So we have this problem that when we look at the sequences, we have a lot of different forms of the quote running across the book. So we have to do a step that we call grouping. And there's many different ways to do this. You could do something like a string edit distance in this area, but since we didn't actually have the text, we basically did a simpler version, which is you sort of look and you see, well, which sequences, this might be the first sentence of a long quote, this might be the middle sentence of a long quote, this might be the tail, which is dropped because of the Speech Act, for example, or some OCR errors. And you basically want to group these together and say all these pieces and all these books are really the same quote. So we call these candidate quotations at this point. And the filtering and ranking process is where we take these billions of candidates and we ask the question, well, which of these are just appearing in the front of a book or the back of a book, in which case they're most likely boilerplate, and you can get rid of those. Which of these have language features which are unusual, too many numbers, so this gets rid of tables of logarithms and prime numbers. And we also have this concept of diffusion or information entropy, which says that a good quote is going to probably exist in more than one author, in more than one publisher. So if we see a quote that exists in 100 books, and all those books are by the same publisher, it's probably some kind of publisher boilerplate, maybe an advertisement at the back of the book or something. If you see a quote that only exists in one author, then it's probably some kind of self-quotation or something. If you see a quote that only exists in one of our library's sources, then it's also suspect, like the reserve book label that we picked up. So we have this notion that a good quote has been sort of distributed throughout the corpus and distributed throughout the publishers, distributed throughout the authors. And we can actually sort of get rid of some that have extremely low diffusion. But the next step is quotes that we believe are reasonable. We basically use a ranking. We demote very short quotes because those tend to be colloquial phrases that tend to repeat. We demote very long quotes because those tend to be short stories in books or letters that are repeating, or things that are too frequent. So we end up with tens of millions of rank quotations. And as I say, tens of thousands of CPU hours later. So this processing is multi-phase across multiple machines. So I run this over 2,000 or 4,000 machines, and it takes many days for it to run through these phases. Unfortunately, we currently only have a batch process for doing this. We don't have an incremental update. I can explain why later. So every few months, we run it again. And what we end up with is what we call a UI for doing within-book navigation and a UI for doing cross-book navigation. So I have like 2 static slides, and then I can switch to a video that shows you how the interaction feels. But we say within-book navigation. This is a little hard to see, but this is the book search page. You're reading the book over here, and on the right, you have the quotations. And this was one of the product manager decisions not to call it quotations because people would think of Bartlett's. So we actually call it popular passages. It's maybe a little bit more generic term. But what you see is that on page 52, there's this passage that repeats in 201 books from 1972 to 2007. And on page 49, there's this passage that occurs in 41 books in these years. So we have this way of basically clicking on the right-hand side and jumping to that passage. We call this within book, helps you find interesting stuff within the book. Obviously, you also want to jump to other books. What other book is talking about the same stuff? So here's a quote. We know now that a text consists not of a line of words releasing a single theological meaning. It's a Roland Barthes quote, and it exists in, I don't know how many here, 94 books in our corpus. And we sort of list them like search results, and you can click on them and jump to that book. So yeah, you can go to this site and see a demo. I should mention that the UI has slightly changed over the last couple of weeks. Okay, sorry. Looks a little more manual. So this is what it looked like a few weeks ago. You're reading a book, Death of an Author, Richard Howard's book. On the right-hand side are the popular passages for the within book. This one, page 52, it occurs in 201 books. You could do more and see a little bit more of these. We actually sort of have a cutoff for how many of these popular passages we store per book. Some nice artifacts are going on here, which aren't part of the demo. Hang on, let me see if I can clean that up. Okay. So actually, the video looks a little bit different than is being shown here. I think we're having some update errors. Okay, and this shows you a cross-book navigation where once you find a quote and you say, well, let me find other books that are like that. Yeah, as you can see, my video is decaying rapidly. So you can go to the books.google.com website and try this. I should mention that the current version, we don't have that right-hand side that shows you the reading in the book. You have to go to the About the Book page, but if you dig around, you'll see it. So let me mention some evaluations. How do we know that we're doing good here? It's a real question. Nobody else has done this kind of data mining of quotations. So we did this thing where we have a ranking of good quotations, medium good quotations, bad quotations. And so we had this basic evaluation where you show people quotations and you say, does this seem like a quotation? Or does this seem like boilerplate, copyright page? table of logarithms? Does it seem like something else? So we did that evaluation 1, and we got a pretty high agreement between the human raters and our system that ranked them. So 88% agreement. So the stuff that we're showing users as good quotations is pretty good. And we also have the ability to look at use over time. So we launched this, and we have thousands of users who are using this. And we look at how do they use this kind of navigation versus the other types of navigation that's available. So the other types of navigation, when you're looking at a book, you can say, what other editions of the book are there? When you're looking at a book, you can say, what's related to this book? There's another link like that. And of course, there's cited by and citation links. So we can actually sort of look at how many users are using each feature, and we see that quotations are high. And part of that, but not all of that, is due to the coverage of quotations. So it turns out that citations, which are here and here, does cite and cites by, actually don't occur in all that many books. Quotations are a much more popular way of doing references between books than formal citations. And you sort of expect that if you sort of look at biography, autobiography, many books in the humanities don't have this scientific discipline of having a strict quotation. So really by these 3 metrics, we had a pretty good idea that our system was a reasonable technique for providing this cross-book hypertext. So we launched this and we showed it to people and we got some feedback. And I want to describe the next step that we did, which is really still in the research lab. This step wasn't launched. When we showed the people the quotations work, they said, oh, that's great, but I don't necessarily want to go to a book in order to see quotations. I want to see quotations as first-class citizens, first-class entities. I want to be able to find a quotation, find related quotations, sort of use them to navigate. So we had this notion that ideas are sort of a subset of quotations. Maybe some quotations are not ideas, they're stories, but a lot of quotations really capture a concept well. And that's why authors are copying them from one book to the other. And this notion of sustainable development is captured in this Brundtland quotation. It's a key idea in eco-politics. So our idea was really to say, looking at a library, in our case, a huge digital library, not this nice library I have at home. Could you ask the question, where are the ideas about tragedy? Where are the ideas about Christianity? Where are the ideas about eternal recurrence? And what's the most important stuff that Friedrich Nietzsche ever said? So, that's what we were trying to do, is bring out from a massive text corpus the ideas. And the problem here, of course, is, if you look at a book like Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and you sort of just are looking at it, you're saying, well, where are the ideas there? If you read this, you also had that feeling. But I think there are some ideas in there. So that's really the problem, obviously based on our whole, project around mining quotations. This is built on it. But we were saying, how can you distinguish ideas from other words? At the surface, all these words look alike. And, of course, we're going to use this quotation idea. And the other problem is that when we talk about ideas like eco-politics or Christianity, there's really no common classification for those. So relations are hidden. So you might have one book talking about Stoicism, another book talking about cosmic determinism, and they're really talking about the same thing. And unless we have this kind of common labeling system or common classification system, how would you collect those? So these are the problems we're trying to solve, trying to link ideas across a major corpus. So I want to give you a little sort of review of history here. That we're not the first people to think about mining ideas and linking ideas and providing sort of an overview of the important concepts. So there was this project called The Great Ideas and the Great Books in the 50s. The University of Chicago and Encyclopedia Britannica published these books. And you can still buy them today, although they're not sold door to door, so don't wait for them to come to you. It's 443 works in 54 volumes, you know, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Adam Smith, sort of that college coursework, the great books of the Western world, essentially. And it was really run by three characters, Professor Mortimer Adler at Chicago, Bob Hutchins, who was the CEO, president of University of Chicago, and William Benton, who was the CEO of Britannica. So they got together and had this